I think it's quite an honor for me to be invited to speak here this evening. Let me start off by just making two statements, just to be clear that we're on the same page. Firstly, yes, it is apartheid. And secondly, no, we black South Africans don't feel insulted that we say that it's apartheid. And in case you think that I'm just making this up, our former president and now deputy president of South Africa, Kgalema Motlanthe, also deputy president of the African National Congress, said, "The current situation for Palestinians in the OPT is worse than conditions were for blacks under the apartheid regime." Sdumo Dlamini, the current president of the Congress of South African Unions, said, "They support Zionism, a version of global racist domination and apartheid based on the doctrine that Jews are superior to Arabs and therefore have a right to oppress them and occupy their country." Desmond Tutu, I'm sure you all know. "I've been very deeply distressed in my visit to the Holy Land. It reminded me so much of what happened to us black people in South Africa. I have seen the humiliation of the Palestinians at checkpoints and roadblocks, suffering like us when young white police officers prevented us from moving about." Willie Madisha, former president of COSATU, said that, "As someone who lived in apartheid South Africa and who has visited Palestine, I say with confidence that Israel is an apartheid state. In fact, I believe that some of Israel's actions make the actions of South Africa's apartheid regime appear pale by comparison." In another place, he said, "Makes apartheid in South Africa look like a Sunday picnic." These are all black South Africans who have been involved in the struggle against apartheid, and so I think we should know what we are talking about. Apartheid, as we understand it, is a systemized or systematic way in which people are discriminated against on the basis of their race or their ethnicity, and where privileges and rights flow to people on the basis of their race and ethnicity. In South Africa, that meant that white people, because they were white, were privileged and had particular kinds of rights that flowed to them, while black people, because they were black, didn't have the same privileges and rights. In the Palestinian context, it means that Jews, because they are Jews, have certain rights and privileges flowing to them, and all those who are not Jews are deprived of those rights and privileges because they are not Jewish. That is apartheid, quite clearly. Now, let me just talk about this apartheid thing and why we say that Israel is an apartheid state at two levels. One, perhaps the less important one, but nevertheless, one is a comparison between Israel and South Africa, and Israel's policies and South Africa's policies. And secondly, measuring Israel in terms of the Convention on Apartheid, because I think that that is crucially important. Apartheid in South Africa was built on three pillars. The first pillar was a kind of formal demarcation of South Africans into different so-called races. The second one was a separation of those then so-called racial groups into different geographic areas. And that also implied various kinds of theft of land of black people to be able to make that real. And thirdly, the third pillar was a security and repressive matrix set up by the state, which included a whole myriad of laws, as well as a security and repressive machinery that operated in a way that would enforce this separation the separation in various kinds of ways. Now, if we look at the way that apartheid operated in South Africa based on these three pillars and consider the Israeli state, we find that, in fact, the same three pillars operate in terms of how the Israeli state makes itself work. So within within Israel, and I think we should consider this itself at two levels. One is Israel in terms of the state of Israel, as it's a bit difficult to speak of the state of Israel, to speak of a state that hasn't declared where its borders are, but nevertheless, let's imagine that it does exist. The state of Israel, in terms of its policies and laws for its own citizens. You have a situation where citizenship is influenced by the fact that people are Jewish or non-Jewish. The law of return of 1950 decided, for example, that Jews had the right to arrive in Israel, as it was then called for 2 years already, and claim citizenship and become a citizenship, to return and claim citizenship of that state. Palestinians, however, didn't have that right. Palestinians, even that had been living on that land for centuries, for millennia, didn't have that right. Yet people who had no lineage links to the land could have that right, simply because they were of a particular ethnicity. The absentee property law of 1948 illustrates very clearly how this discrimination took place. In terms of the absentee property law, for example, Palestinians were divided into 3 categories, including a category called absentee, which means that even though you had been living on this land for, as I say, for millennia or for centuries, but if for a particular period between 1947 and 48, you were not there, which meant for all of those Palestinian refugees that were terrorized off their lands and ended up either in the West Bank or Gaza at the time, or in Beirut, in Lebanon, in Jordan, or in Syria as refugees, they had no right to return to their land because they were absentees. You even had a category called present absentees, which means they actually were present in this new state called Israel, but they happened not to be present in their homes in that period. And so they were internally displaced. They don't have the right to go back to their homes. And so you have thousands of Palestinians today living in Israel who are present absentees, living in what we in South Africa would call squatter camps, in unrecognized villages, etc., with no services, and not having the full rights of other Palestinian citizens. And I say other Palestinian citizens, not other citizens, because that in itself is problematic. If we consider the way that land usage and ownership operates within Israel, I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan, but just within Israel, Palestinians make up about 20% of the population. 93% of the land in Israel is reserved as what are called national lands. Of that, a large percentage belong to the state lands, and the other percentage belongs to the Jewish National Fund, JNF lands. All of these are for the exclusive use of Jews. Palestinians can only have access to land in that other 7%, which are referred to as private lands. So making up 20% of the population, they still, of course, they compete with Jews for access to that 7%. 93% of the land is for exclusively Jewish use. We used to talk in South Africa about how 13% of the land was reserved for 97% of the population, and 13% of the population had control of 97% of the land. The situation that I just painted within Israel is worse. But that's talking just about Israel itself, and a number of other laws that are discriminatory. And if they're not laws, then they are, for example, judgments by the Supreme Court that reflect, for example, in South Africa we had the Group Areas Act, which determined that people of particular races could only live in particular areas. Israel doesn't exactly have a law like that, but various Supreme Court rulings have decided, for example, that Palestinian families are not allowed to live in areas that are mainly Jewish. In effect, the same kind of thing as we had in South Africa. But when we look at the other part of this, which is the occupied Palestinian territory, then we also have a system of apartheid based on the same kind of, the same three pillars operating there. We can talk about residential areas being exclusively for Jews. We can talk about roads being exclusively for Jews, which incidentally we never had in South Africa. We never had roads that were exclusively for whites, for white use. And various other ways in which Palestinians in the occupied territories are discriminated against simply because they are not Jews. Access to water, control over water, various other kinds of resources, control over the movement of people. Hence, when Archbishop Tutu talks about the restriction on people's movements and how in South Africa we had pass laws so that black people had to produce their passes whenever they moved around, the situation in the West Bank is much, much worse than that, with checkpoints and all kinds of other restrictions on the movements of people. And so the three pillars of apartheid that I spoke about are reflected both in Israel as well as in the occupied Palestinian territory. Of course, if we talk about the third pillar, the repressive machinery of the state, then the comparison for South Africans just goes off the radar. It doesn't exist. We never had in South Africa a situation, for example, where in black townships we saw tanks or helicopter gunships or fighter jets flying overhead and bombing and firing at homes and residential areas. This never happened in the entire period of apartheid in South Africa. The repression that Palestinians see on a daily basis is much worse than what black South Africans faced in South Africa under the worst times, under states of emergency, under apartheid. I'm going to move on, and we can talk more about apartheid a little later in the discussion if people want to. And turn to the question of BDS and the theme for this session, 5 years after the call, successes of the BDS campaign. On the 9th July 2005, close to 150 Palestinian organizations issued a historic declaration, a document which has become even more significant over the past 5 years than it was when it was issued. The document was the Palestinian call for BDS against Israel. 4 days after it was issued, on the 13th of July 2005, the United Nations International Civil Society Conference in support of Middle East peace issued a declaration which said, "We recognize that our strength lies in our ability to work collectively in unified campaigns and actions. We urge international, national, and regional social movements, organizations, and coalitions to support the unified call of Palestinian civil society for a global campaign of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, to pressure Israel to end the occupation and fully comply with international law and all relevant United Nations resolutions." 4 days after the call was issued. It seemed to those of us that were at that conference as if civil society internationally had been waiting for Palestinians unequivocally to call on them in this manner. I don't think that even the drafters of the call realized what a quick and effective response there would be to their appeal. Quick and effective not only in 4 days after they made the call, but even in the past 5 years. And let me say at this point that I often get asked, you know, this BDS thing is going to take years and it's a long process. Do you think it'll ever work? You know, in the South African context, the call for sanctions against the apartheid state were made in 1960, in the 1960s, in the mid-1960s. The BDS campaign, we didn't call it that in those days, but the BDS campaign against South Africa actually only became effective or started taking root in the 1980s. Late 70s, but in the 1980s in reality. It took about 30 years before we had our first democratic elections. The pace at which BDS, in support of the Palestinian people, has taken root across the globe has been much, much faster than what we experienced. So, 5 years after the call has been made, as John pointed out as well, BDS has become a term that now has global resonance, that is used in almost equal measure by Palestinian supporters and their Zionist detractors, as John pointed out, and is being recognized by Zionists as a danger to their racist project in Palestine. It is because BDS is effective that there is such a hysterical campaign against it by the Israeli state and by its apologists all over the world. BDS, we are told, is the new anti-Semitism. BDS is slanderous. BDS is anti-Jewish. And the recent detentions of Muhammad Uthman and Jamal Jumma from the West Bank show that BDS is taken so seriously by Israel that it will even use its repressive machinery to try to silence some of the prominent BDS advocates. They both, thankfully, have been released. What has the BDS campaign in the past 5 years achieved? Now, Salma has mentioned some of these earlier on, so I'm going to try not to repeat what she has said. I certainly can't give you a full list. It's a list that's too long for the time I have, but I want to point to some of the more important achievements in the past 5 years. There have been a lot. There's a growing international fervor and fever around BDS, around supporting an effective non-violent response to Israel's militarist, brutal, criminal acts of violence against the Palestinian people. So let me just recount a few of these achievements. One, I should say, is the campaign against Veolia, the company that, one of the two companies that is involved in the building of the light rail system connecting Jerusalem to the settlements. Veolia is continuing with the project, and they haven't pulled out despite the campaign against them. But in the past 2 years or so, less than 2 years I think it is, Veolia has lost contracts to the value of about $10 billion around the world. And this is entirely because of the BDS campaign and the campaign against Veolia. Those who have pulled contracts include municipalities, include various kinds of government structures around the world, from Australia to Norway to other parts of the world. 10 billion. If you asked what BDS is worth, well, in this one instance, it's worth more than $10 billion. Let's just look at a few instances from last year, just 2009. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers, Salma spoke about. Also in January 2009, Western Australian members of the Maritime Union of Australia voted to support BDS. Also in January 2009, a call by 300 Canadian academics urged the Canadian government to implement sanctions against the Israeli government. CUPE's steps that it took at its annual conference in February 2009. Also February 2009, the Church of England announced it had divested from Caterpillar, whose bulldozers, of course, you know what role they play in destroying the homes of Palestinians. Also in February 2009, dozens of French academics issued a statement committing themselves, quote, to cease all collaboration with Israeli institutions participating in the occupation and declare our solidarity with those who in Israel struggle courageously for the human, social, and political rights of Palestinians. They call on the government to apply to Israel a program of boycott, divestments, and sanctions. Also in February 2009, the South African dock workers that refused to offload the ship at the Durban harbour. Also in February 2009, Hampshire College, which incidentally, and I have to mention this again because Hampshire College, by the way, was the first university in the US to divest from apartheid South Africa as well. Became the first university to divest from Israel. One of the most important developments in the United Kingdom was the passing of an unprecedented number of boycott-related motions at the University College Union's annual congress in May last year, the UCU. The UCU, representing over 100,000 academics and related staff, passed a number of resolutions at its congress in the direction of applying effective pressure on Israel and holding it accountable for its colonial and apartheid policies. Again in May, more than 40 Australian academics signed a statement calling for a boycott of Israeli academic and cultural institutions. Again in May, the Edinburgh International Film Festival organizers announced that they were returning funds donated by the Israeli embassy, admitting that it had been a mistake to accept the funds. Setting a precedent in applying the cultural boycott, the eminent British filmmaker Ken Loach threatened to boycott the festival unless organizers returned the contributions. Ken Loach, by the way, also withdrew his film Looking for Eric from the Melbourne International Film Festival because that festival received funding from the Israeli government and refused to return it. In August last year, Amnesty International was successfully pressured as a result of an effective BDS campaign that lasted several weeks to withdraw its support for a Leonard Cohen concert that was held in Israel in violation of the boycott guidelines. In September, the British Trade Unions Congress, TUC, representing over 6 million workers, adopted a historic decision supporting a BDS motion put forth by the Fire Brigades Union. The FBU, an affiliate of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Britain, had adopted BDS in May of last year, taking it upon itself to, quote, support and promote throughout the trade union and labor movement a campaign to boycott Israeli goods, disinvest from Israeli institutions, and for sanctions to be taken against Israel, similar to those sanctions imposed by the international movement against apartheid in South Africa. In April 2009, the Scottish Trade Union Congress, representing all Scottish trade unions, voted overwhelmingly to commit to BDS against Israel and became the third national trade union federation to commit to BDS after the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and South Africa's COSATU. Salma spoke about the very significant campaign against the Toronto International Film Festival that was also last year in September. BDS is not a toy for us to tinker with. It is no longer just a good idea for us to try out. It is a global campaign and a global movement that will sound the death knell for Israel's apartheid project. Just as the global anti-apartheid movement and its campaign to isolate the apartheid South African state was a non-violent weapon that ultimately helped to bring apartheid in South Africa to its knees, so too will the BDS campaign help bring apartheid in Israel to its knees. As a South African who lived and suffered under and fought against apartheid and racist capitalism in my country, and being committed to struggling against apartheid wherever it might exist, I am convinced that our joining together in this movement will prove us to be on the right side of history and on the right side of morality. Because supporting racism is immoral, excusing racism is immoral, and tolerating racism is immoral. We have only one choice: to stand on the side of justice and the suffering and oppressed people of Palestine and the world, or forever to live with the knowledge that we deliberately passed up a unique opportunity presented to us by BDS to do the right thing and to be part of history. Thank you.